Last night I was out walking after the sunset, as I often do during these hot summer days. It has the added bonus of being less people-y, which, as we're finding ourselves in the middle of this pandemic that just keeps dragging on, I know. It's always desirable for places to be a little less people-y, right? I'm not sure if you've played Walking Path Chicken yet with somebody who's coming toward you, but they're usually also engrossed in their workout playlist, and then you just kind of wait it out to see who will step off the path first and go on the grass or the road. And then if it gets a little too close, then it gets a little hairy of who has the right of way. Like, if it's their jogger, okay, step off the path. Is it, just a random person walking your way at the same pace? Who steps off the path? Who gets in the road? It's a little interesting. So I like to go at night. And armed with my little can of pepper spray and a great podcast, I set out last night as usual. I just finished the podcast, which was on hospitality of all things, and you'll see why this comes in a moment, when I noticed a car pulled to the side with its hazards flashing, and there was a man that was standing outside the car talking to the couple. And so I pulled my earbuds out just to ask if anyone needed assistance and also to make sure everything was all right. It's the thing to do. The couple in the car had hit a dog. It had actually left this gigantic, dent in the front, and this huge part of their front bumper was dragging, and it was directly in front of the driver's side wheel. The man who'd also stopped while he was on his walk was in the process of trying to convince these out-of-town folks that they needed to at least pull off of 11th, which, if you're not familiar with Hanford, which is where I live, it's a pretty busy street. And late at night, people just go barreling down that. And I echoed this need to pull off and onto a side street because I have been walking down 11th and stepped off the path, in that game of pedestrian chicken, to let somebody else have the right of way on the path, and found myself in the street while somebody is going down the street at 80 miles an hour. It's a scary situation and not one you want to be under your car trying to figure out what's going on for. And so that wasn't the place to be fumbling around in the trunk for a jack either. So there was that issue of this dangling piece of plastic directly in front of the wheel. And the other person that had stopped was like, well, do you have any string, a bungee cord? Do you have anything we could use to tie this up? And we looked around in the car, all maintaining some social distance, and did not find a thing. So then I realized I have this, for lack of a better word, it's an athletic fanny pack. It is the thing I made fun of my mom for wearing when we went on the junior high trip to Washington, D.C., because she insisted on wearing this fanny pack. Now I have one for when I go walking. But I pulled this off and it was stretchy. And so we were able to tie up the bumper, the front. I don't even know what all these car parts are called, but we were able to tie it up, kind of wrapping it around, I guess, the grill. Is that what that is? And then we clasped it together, and it's this nice, wonderful, elastic thing. So we were able to do that. And the couple were able to move their car to a safer place. And the other man and I carried on with our walks once we knew that they were okay to get things figured out, call a tow truck, whatever they needed to do. I left my little pack with them, my little fanny pack with them, because it's no big deal, whatever. It's better to tie up their bumper than for me to, have it for the rest of my walk. So I carried on and didn't forget about the other victim of this accident, and I crossed the street to go look for the dog they'd hit and found a man sitting on the grass petting this beautiful German Shepherd, and he was waiting for the police to come pick up the animal to take it to Animal Control Services. And his calming presence was keeping this injured dog at peace while laying there on the grass panting heavily, and I could feel his calming presence. And I have wondered a few times what hospitality looks like in this time when we are afraid of disease transmission. And I saw a glimpse of an answer last night. People had stopped what they were doing while still observing as much distancing as possible to keep each other safe, and jumped in to help wherever they could. Having just listened to a podcast about the kind of hospitality that was discussed in our Matthew reading, I couldn't help but see a through line. Today's gospel is the end piece to last week's reading. If you remember from last week, we heard about the potential dangers of picking up the cross and following Jesus. Discipleship comes with risk. The man who was caring for the dog in my imperfect illustration from last night, for instance, was risking the dog turning on him in fear and in pain. But caring for a creature in pain overrode the potential danger of the situation. As disciples, we risk alienation, awkward conversations, and evil too. We'll just leave that there. That misspoken thing, we'll just leave that out there. And we even risk potential violence as we follow Christ's lead. This week's reading picks up from there, talking about hospitality, and not just giving hospitality, which we hear about in so many places in the Gospels and can never discount how important that is, but also being on the receiving end of hospitality too. It's kind of this holistic view of it. There are two sides of the same coin that as followers of Christ have to do and do well. Unfortunately, hospitality isn't something that our culture is really great at. America has this ruggedly individual mindset that lends itself more to suspicion of others than to openness or interconnection among others. When it comes to doing the hospitable thing, we aren't always putting our best foot forward. Our doormats may say welcome in this cutesy, artsy font, but our Ring doorbells with video monitoring say otherwise. We can see our American individualism play out on a large scale as we hear the indignant statement, "Well, I'm not wearing a mask," even though studies have shown that mask wearing prevents the spread of airborne transmission of COVID-19. This is not an individual failing on part of the cranky person without a mask who's just wanting to shop at Trader Joe's without smelling her own coffee breath. But it's a symptom of a much larger problem stemming from a culture that values the individual over the collective, that places worth on my needs over a compassionate sense of hospitality for the others in our immediate breathing space, which brings me to sin. In our reading from Romans, sin plays a pretty huge part in it, and I'm not sure what your upbringing was, but I'm positive that if you spent much time hanging out in churches, you feel some sort of way about sin. For me, talk of sin makes me anxious. I was not raised with a lot of focus on sin, and I don't want to speak for all UCC churches, but I think it's fairly common for those of us in progressive faith circles to downplay sin because it is divisive and it has been weaponized across humanity and across history. And it's not really a part of that feel-good story we love to tell about our loving God. I'm so uncomfortable with talking about sin that I'm pretty sure I had panic attacks the entire few weeks that we spent on sin in my intro theology class, which of course meant I was incapable of thinking too deeply about sin because I was just trying to get through the class session without having to have an opinion either way. But to avoid seriously regarding sin is dangerous in its own way. If we don't approach the topic of sin, it's impossible to know how we are participating in it without even knowing. So let's talk about sin, baby. I'm just going to say it. Rugged American individualism. I'm making my muscles right now. Horatio Alger mythology and pulling oneself by one's bootstraps. I don't have bootstraps. I've got my husband's shoe though. All of that is, I'm just going to say it, it's a sin. This is counter to everything we've ever been taught, indoctrinated into, and believe about how we operate as individuals in a society. But it is also a root of so many of the injustices that we are actively speaking on, marching on, and getting into Facebook arguments in the comments section on today. Our view of sin as Americans is equally individualized. Just as we look at a person who is unable to escape poverty and wonder what they did wrong to not be able to rise up out of their situation, we also have taken sin and packaged it into these like little individual failings, seeing it as actions that one person does to impact them negatively, without viewing sin as a whole big ball of yuck that we're all wrapped up in. We've used sin as a way to exclude folks from our dinner tables, or at least make them feel like they're less than when we espouse love the sinner and hate the sin, making this about them and their morality while lifting our own to a higher, purer level. But what if, when we think about sin, we don't just conjure up images of lust, greed, gluttony, or any of the other common individual sins as labels that can be slapped on anyone that we feel is a sinner? What if we looked at a bigger, less convenient picture of what it means to truly sin? Corporate sin does just this. To our American ears, when we hear of corporate sin, we might immediately waggle our fingers at Walmart or Amazon or some big corporation for their sins because we hear corporate, right? But again, that's still focusing on individual sin, moral failing that can be pinned to somebody else's lapel and not mine. Corporate sin instead is looking at the sins that are committed in which we are all involved. These sins are harder for us to pinpoint and therefore easier to bypass. However, these are the ones that get to the heart of Christ's teaching in a way that talking about individual sin never will. Corporate sins are the ones that uphold unjust systems of power. They're the ones that seem justified because that's just the way things are. Corporate sin is slavery as an institution that was transformed into Jim Crow and then into mass incarceration and racial profiling by police. Corporate sin is committed then when we refuse to acknowledge that this harm has been done, that reparations have never been made, that people die because of lack of access to health care or because implicit bias makes police officers jumpy and ready to use force when dealing with Black people, and unsuspicious and accommodating in their dealing with white people accused of similar crimes. Corporate sin is valuing a healthcare provider's right to refuse to serve a person because they are transgender, since this upholds the individual's right to their religious practice. We commit corporate sin when we are not outraged that basic human rights are being denied to people who are getting sick and requiring medical care, just like everybody does, because of some out-of-context, cherry-picked scriptural excuse for discrimination. Corporate sin is the destruction of the earth, its poverty, its homelessness, its child labor. Participating in corporate sin isn't just on our cities to find solutions to homelessness, but it's on each of us when we don't even look the beggar on a corner in the eye and see the humanity of the human being that is sitting there. It isn't on the family that cannot rise out of poverty because of decades of redlining and unfair housing and labor practices, but it's on us for allowing it to happen. It isn't on the giant clothing companies that use child labor to manufacture their products cheaply, but it is on us for not looking at the tag to see where it's made or looking into the practices of the company, just seeing the dollar signs. Corporate sin is failing to see the value in protecting one another during a pandemic, and it is played out in every time we value our own personal diva tantrum comfort over the health and welfare of people we don't know next to us in the produce aisle. Sin goes beyond individual moral failing, and the sins we should be going after as followers of Christ who vow to uphold hospitality and justice are the ones we ourselves are deeply complicit in. We don't get a free pass just because we are not under law, but under grace, as Paul writes to the Romans. We must address these deeper, bigger, systemic, in our air and water sins. Paul uses the illustration as either slaves to the one whom we obey or slaves to sin, but as we've not had a great track record with that word here in America, where meritocracy and privilege run rampant, instead, we need to check where our allegiance lies. Is it to upholding systems that are intended to keep some in poverty while others profit? Or is it to God? Is our allegiance to guarding our own position of privilege or ignoring that it exists? Or is it to an understanding and then tearing down white supremacy? As we wrap up, to cycle back to Matthew, as we are offering a cup of cold water, extending life-giving, life-affirming hospitality to these little ones, to use Jesus's words, or to these ones created in the image of God. Hint, that's everybody. Or is our allegiance to propping up and perpetuating large-scale systems of sin? This week, I encourage each of us to explore the ways we have ignored or overlooked or purposely avoided our own complicity in the big picture corporate sin. Which of these things made you squirm the most or bubble up with indignation and anger? Start there, if you felt any feelings like that. Or what tugged at your heart, filled you with sorrow, guilt, grief? Start there. Even though we're all part of these gigantic systems, that doesn't mean we're helpless or actionless in dismantling them. Dig in, pray, and read how Jesus responded to similar situations. Find one small thing you can do this week that can loosen your own hold on keeping that sin propped up. Is it donating to your local BLM or NAACP chapter, or is it deciding to stop buying plastic when possible? Is it committing to ride sharing instead of driving alone? Is it wearing a mask to Tractor Supply or helping a stranger on the side of the road, even though it's dark and you're as vulnerable as they are? Find one thing and do it with intention, knowing you are doing it for love of neighbor, for love of children and future generations, for love of creation, and most of all, for love of Jesus Christ. God be with you.